I was thinking about, you were talking about Passover. I love the season of Easter and Passover and everything that's celebrated at that time. And I remember a Christian comedian that I heard, this was a couple of years ago, he was talking about, believers during COVID, when we were all like locked in our houses and all that goofy stuff. I know that's like low-key post-traumatic, so I won't get into that. But he was talking about how, believers, we were praying to have COVID pass over our houses. We were all going out wiping Chick-fil-A sauce around our door frame so that COVID would pass over. And I was like, that's pretty funny. And so I always think about that. Every time Passover gets brought up, I always think about that joke. If you have your Bibles open to Mark chapter 5, I needed a rim shot on that one. I didn't get it. It's okay. That joke went over like a Passover. And so no worries. We'll try better next time. And so if you have your Bibles open to Mark chapter 5, so excited to we're talking about miracles today. And sometimes it's kind of funny when this happens all the time, whether it be a children's sermon or a worship song, some element that you're not like, we didn't get together and game plan children's sermon how it was going to match my service or my sermon this morning, but it does really well. Because we're finishing up a little two-part deal. We were talking about miracles last week, and there's an element of miracles that comes in this idea of prayer through faith. Believing God is going to do something, even when we don't know exactly when, where, and how it's going to happen, but we believe with all of our might that He will. Without a shadow of a doubt, we know that He will come through. Just like we learned this morning, and our young friends learned, the timing of that is not always known, not always on the nail, but God works it out. So once again, my children aren't here, so I can do whatever I want. And so my girls are going to Oklahoma State University next year. They're excited. They love OSU. They're pumped about it. They can't wait. My oldest two, my twins, who are 18, because I'm a huge OU fan. That's a long story. We don't have time to get into it, all right? And so I went to OSU. It's a whole thing. But my kids vicariously every now and again will go to an OU game with me or whatever, or watch a game alongside me or whatever. And my oldest twin has grown a little bit of an affinity because he's cute, the quarterback for OU. She thinks he's good looking, right? She's going to die if she ever finds out about this. But it's pretty funny. So that's neither here nor there. So her 18th birthday is rolling around. I've shared this story before about Grayson, the punter at OU, who's a good friend of mine, and I mentor and disciple some and get to spend time with him. And I just had this wild idea. I was like, what would be really funny? And I don't even know if Grayson can pull this off. I wonder if he could get something that John Mateer has used or played in a game and would give it to the twins for their 18th birthday. So I called Grayson. Grayson, I said, this is a long shot. But hey, do you think, I said, I'll send you something if you'll sign it or whatever. It's like, do you think John would do something like that? And Grayson and John have become friends through FCA, and they hang out quite a bit. And he's like, yeah, I think I can work something out. And I was like, okay. So Grayson calls me like a week later. He says, so do you think that they would like something really cool? And I was like, oh, I'm sure. They think it was awesome, whatever. He goes, I talked to John, and John wants to give him a pair of his cleats that he wore in a game. And I was like, well, that is out kicking your coverage right there. I was like, whoa. I was like, that is cool. And he goes, I've got them. He gave them to me. He's like, we got to kind of keep it low key because everybody in the church now is going to want me to go get some John Mateers and bring it to him, start breaking into his house and stealing his stuff. All right. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. He said, so last Sunday, on my way back from here, I got a video that popped on my phone that my wife sent me of Elena Grayson going up to the twins and said, hey, I got something for you in my car. Your dad arranged a birthday gift for you guys, and I had to bring it up. And they were like, what? Because their birthday had been like a month ago, but it took a few weeks to get this all worked out. And so they go out to the car, and I get this video, and it's him turning around and handing him, and it's got number 10 on the heel. He has his number on the heel and everything, and so they just freak out. The video is hysterical. They're like holding these old dirty shoes, and they're just like, oh, they're so excited because something that they had asked for or didn't even know that they needed necessarily or wanted have been provided. God sometimes does things like that. He just works it out in his perfect planning and timing. And sometimes it's things you didn't even know you needed. Now, sometimes it's everything that you know that you need. It's a sickness, it's an ailment, it's a pain, it's a hurt, it's a worry. But God always seems to work it out. And I was thinking about that this week, and I was like, here I put my faith and trust in a 21-year-old young man to do something that's kind of wild. But he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Now, he could have texted me back and said, man, it's just not going to work out. And I'd be like, that's okay. Because that's a frivolous thing. You know, that's something fun. But when I go to God and I ask God, I need a mountain moved here, whatever that mountain looks like. He never texts me back or calls me back or in prayer and says, no can do. Not interested. It's not in my wheelhouse. It's not really good at that. I've never gotten that response. Because God is the God of those things. And like we talked about last week, everything is under his dominion. Everything is in his grasp, and he is in control of every physical and non-physical element that you could think of. And regardless of where you're at in your station in life and where it is, if God decides to enter into your space and time and do a miracle of what you have prayed about through faith, he will do so. Now, I don't know when, where, or how, but he will. So what evidence do we have of that? Well, I think the Bible's full of it. I think the Bible's full of stories and texts. And one today, and I only recently stumbled across this on my own study and watched a video on it recently and kind of dug into it myself a little bit to find out that it was, because sometimes people say things, you're like, oh, I'm going to get into that a little bit just to make sure we're, historically and theologically and biblically correct. And he's a pastor and a reputable one. And so when I got into this, and we'll get there in a little bit, I want you to mark a spot that the last chapter of the book of Malachi. We're gonna reference that here in just a little bit. But the miracle we're going to look at today is the woman who had been suffering from bleeding for 12 years. She'd had some sort of condition that she was hemorrhaging blood, and she had been doing so for years, over a decade. The Bible tells us, to the point that she had exhausted her resources, her finances, everything that she had. She'd literally become basically a cast out in her own society at this point because of she'd been rendered unclean by the church. So my guess is she's living on the street, completely rejected by her culture and by her society, and has no station in life whatsoever. Okay? So let's look at Mark chapter 5. We're going to start it. So Jesus had actually just healed a friend of the ministry, Jairus' daughter. And then starting in verse 24, it says a great crowd was following him. You remember, Jesus had become almost kind of rock star status. He had a huge following. He had about 70 to 100 that traveled with him regularly anyway, that were just a part of his ministry and what he did. But then as he traveled from city to city and his ministry and the word of what he had done had gone before him, the crowds grew even larger. At times, as the Bible tells us, he would have to escape from one space to the next. In fact, the previous verses said that he had gone to the other side of the lake, of the Sea of Galilee, to escape the throngs of people that were following him. So this great crowd was following him, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians, had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. The word there they use in Hebrew is fringe or edge of his garment. So she didn't grab his cloak like by his shoulders. She didn't grab it by the waist. She grabbed it by the lower part or the fringe. In the Hebrew, that word is called kanaf. Okay? So the kanaf has a couple of different meanings in their language. Okay? In the Hebrew language. Now we're going to get to that here in just a second. So just park that there for a second. She had heard that he was coming, this Jesus who had done these things, who had performed these miracles. She had exhausted everything that she could do physically to be healed. In fact, it had been made worse to the point of death, to the point of destitution, of everything that you could possibly imagine that was wrong. And she knew that the only thing that was going to save her was him. There was nothing left to do. She was at the end of her rope, and she touches the fringe of his garment. In verse 28, she said, "For if I even touch even his garments, I will be made well." And in verse 29, it says, "And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease." In verse 30, it says, "And Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone from him, immediately turned and said, as if he didn't know, 'Who touched my garments? Who touched the fringe?'" He knew instantly. Why? Two things. One, because of her faith. It was powerful. He literally felt the power of the Spirit leave his body through her faith. Her faith drew God's power from him to the point of healing her in an instant. So, goes back to what we talked about last week. Why does a poor, destitute woman who has no status whatsoever, no claim to anything, dying of an illness, has nothing to gain from anything other than knowing that God will restore her and heal her if she can just touch that fringe, that kanaf? So, what drives someone to do that? I take you to Malachi. Because Jesus says he felt it leave him. He knew he had been touched. He knew that it had happened. It was a predestined moment before time and space that it would take place in the way that it would. So what in the world would possess her? I believe that because she's a Jewish woman, she had read in the Bible. I mean, they all had. They all were versed in it. I think that when she read Malachi chapter 4 as a young woman, and she had studied the book of Malachi, because remember the book of Malachi was written 400 years before Jesus ever walked on the earth physically. There's Malachi, then immediately the Gospels, correct? This is the last book of the Old Testament. We have the intertestamental period. It's about 400 years from the end of Malachi to Matthew. Because what happens is you have Malachi, then you have the first story of Matthew, which is the birth of Jesus, all right? So this would have been written, she would have read this in the temple. At some point, she'd have been exposed to this text, and she would have read it, and I think she believed it, and I believe she specifically believed in verse 2 of chapter 4. My Bible calls it the great day of the Lord. She goes, "But you will have fear for my name. The Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in his kanaf," his wings. Because the same word for wings is the same word for fringe. At some point, I truly believe in her life, she had read that passage, and at some point, she had come to terms with the fact and understood that there would be this healing. This is Micah talking about Jesus. Jesus, there's one who's coming who will have healings in his fringe. His very fringe of his garment will heal you. Fast forward to her adult life. With all the faith that she could muster in her life, she saw healing in his wings. I truly believe that she is sitting there and she is hearkening back to Malachi chapter 4, who she has probably been exposed to as a young woman, and she knows that this is the one. This is who we've been waiting for. And the Bible has told me, the writings of the prophet Malachi have told me that if I will just touch the fringe of his garment, there is healing there. And I think she believed with all the faith in her being that it was true. and that she was willing to do whatever it took. If that meant crawling across broken glass, whatever the case may be, she was going to get to the fringe of his garment. She didn't want to touch his hand. She didn't want a prayer. She didn't want anything. She just knew that the Bible said, if I could just get to the fringe of his garment and touch it, I know that there's healing there. Why does she believe that? Because the Bible told her there was. The Bible told her as a child, as a young person, when she had read that text, that when you come in the presence of the Messiah, all you got to do is touch the hem of his robe and he'll heal you. And I think her faith was so strong and so powerful and so resolute that when she touched it, it was so powerful that Jesus felt it. He stopped and said, "Who touched me?" He doesn't have any other encounter like that in Scripture, where the faith is so resolute and so powerful of this person that when they just they didn't even physically come in contact with each other, just the sheer touch. Jesus knew exactly who it was. He'd been waiting for 400 years for this moment. In time and space, he was like, who was that? Her faith is still resolute. He felt the power of his Father, the power of the Holy Spirit literally leave his body and enter into hers and restore her in an instant. Jesus felt it. How do we know that God does miracles? Because the Bible tells us that when we pray with resolute and with faith that is stainless steel, galvanized and pure, he feels it and he moves accordingly. It stirs his heart. As much as our sin breaks his heart, our faith stirs it. When Jesus asked the disciples later on in Matthew chapter 16, they're having this conversation about who do you say that I am? And there's some say Elijah, or one of the prophets, maybe even Malachi, Jeremiah, Elijah. But Simon answers, no, you're the one. You're the one we'll be waiting. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And it stirs Jesus. Because what does Jesus say back to him? Blessed are you, Simon, son of Barjona, because that was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father who is in heaven. The Spirit has moved in your heart and told you the truth, and you had the courage to say it out loud. It stirred Jesus' heart to affirm him in what he had said. Now, open mouth 5 verses later, insert foot, because Peter, later on, he says, and Jesus affirms him by saying, on this truth I will build my rock, right? I'll build my church. That's why Peter's often referred to as the rock, right? Because of that statement. Now remember, Peter's not the physical rock, all right? The statement is the rock, all right? The Christ, the Son of the living God, the cornerstone, if you will, all right? And so that's when he refers to the rock, that's what he's referring to. And then later on, just in a handful of verses, Jesus is going to start talking about his betrayal. And Peter was like, never. And you want to talk about the prop up of prop ups, man. Jesus is like, Son of the living God has revealed this to you. You are awesome. Great job. You have stirred the Spirit. And then later on, he's like, I will never let this happen. He's like, get behind me, Satan. You want to talk about that sucker turned on a dime. Because truth is truth. Right? We can be lifted up and we can be sometimes admonished in the same breath. But his faith was what made him whole in those moments. And what we see out of Peter is, especially after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus affirms Peter, as we know he denies Christ, but he goes later on and affirms him, feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. If you love me, feed my sheep. 3 times restores Peter. But we see Peter, because of that moment, because of his faith, because of his restoration, because of the things that he saw, he becomes this great leader of the church, because he had seen within the faith that bore out inside of him. When we see God do things, and this is what the beauty of when we see God move, and we see God do a miracle, and we see God do things that we cannot explain, do we stop talking about it? I don't think so. I think we should get louder. We have to talk about the things that we see God do. We can't just say, that's awesome, and then we put a lid on it and we just move on. Do you think, like we talked about last week, or this woman or the blind man that we've talked about, do you think that this was just a one-off and they just walked back into their towns, woman had been bleeding for years, laying on the side of the road, destitute, in a terrible situation, now is made fully whole? Or a blind man who begged at a gate his whole life and now has sight and walks around? Or their friend Lazarus, who'd been dead for days and he called out of a grave and now he goes, to the restaurants on Wednesdays and hangs with his friends? Do you not think that when they walked back into their communities, there wasn't a little bit of a buzz? I mean, I grew up in a small town. It's like little small town rumor, right, gets going around. It's like a wildfire, right? Everybody talking about it. Now you got Facebook, and so, my goodness. Our shenanigans can be around the world in a couple of clicks and a post, right? I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty pumped that I did not grow up in the social media age or the cell phone age. It was more like the Stone Age, but it is what it is. Sometimes you got to count your blessings and name them one by one. All right? So you can imagine. Do you not think that Lazarus, when he walked in, he sat down, going to the cafe or whatever, and he's hanging out, and they're all like, there's probably a little bit of a, because everybody went to his funeral a week earlier. And they're like, he's right over there. Do you not think that Lazarus was like, yes, I was dead for many days, but God raised me from. He's mentioned maybe one other time in the New Testament. And most of these stories are never mentioned again because I don't think they need to be mentioned again because their life becomes this testimony of this is what God does when he wants to do what he wants to do. Their story becomes their life and their testimony, and they tell it everywhere they go. I can't imagine the amount of podcasts Lazarus would be on if he were alive today. The dude would be making the rounds. All right? Same with the woman who's been bleeding, or the blind man. He'd be on every television show. He'd be on every network. He'd be on everything, every social media. He'd have 1 million followers overnight. Right? He'd be an absolute rock star. The amount of gravitational pull that they would have in today's culture would be unbelievable, like a black hole. There'd be so much just drawn to him because it'd be just unimaginable. That's why when God does the things that he does, we can't just go mute about it. When God moves in our presence and he does something that is just outlandish, we have to keep telling that story. We have to remind people this is what God does. I think a lot of believers have fallen asleep on the movement and the power and the miracles of God. And we have become mute and silent on it because they're going to think I'm weird. Honest truth. They're like, well, that's weird to talk about. Miracles are weird. I can't explain them. I've seen them in my own life. I've seen things I cannot explain. God has just done something I do not understand. I remember a pastor telling me a story one time. His name's Rod Masteller, preached for a long time. A young lady in his ministry at Putnam City Baptist Church right here in Oklahoma City. This isn't some third world country or halfway around the world. I can march some missionaries up here that I've known. Southern Baptist IMB missionaries I've known my whole life, and they've been around the world, and they're like, Mick, I have seen things you cannot explain. I have seen babies come back to life. I have seen cancers healed. I have seen things in the dark corners of this planet that God does things every single day that you and I would shudder at the thought of what it looks like. And I remember I had the pleasure as a young late high school, early college student, to spend some time with Rod, who had an incredible sermon series on miracles, and he actually had a young lady that came alongside a lot of time. She was in a car accident. The car burst into flames while she was inside of it. Could not get out. Single car accident, lost control of her vehicle. and it ignited. And by the time the paramedics arrived and the fire department there, they assumed, and the cool thing is Rod actually had one of the paramedics and one of the firefighters for the longest time would come and share their story that were first responders on the scene. They kind of turned their lights off and slow rolled up because they were like, no way anyone survives. And so obviously they're trying to just, assess the scene as they got there, and as they get out of their vehicles and they start moving, they see her body laying to the side of the road. So they rush up to her, and she's alive. And they're like, oh my gosh. One, how did she get out of the car? And she's by herself laying on the road. And then they're like, she had some burns on her arms and a little bit on her legs, but like her head, neck, and chest and everywhere was just completely clear. No burns. And they put the fire out, and they start doing some emergency response stuff on her, and she starts to talk a little bit to him, and she doesn't sound like she's got any scarring or smoke in her lungs. And the whole time they're just like, what is happening? And she starts talking about another person. So then the paramedics freak out that there's somebody else in the car. And so after the scene, they rush her off to the Baptist hospital, to the burn unit Baptist. They find there's nobody else in the car. There was no other body in the car, and they're like, they're like, maybe she just stressed. Something along those lines. Maybe she's just saying stuff, out of just the trauma in the moment. But they still could not wrap their mind around, out of her crumpled car, how she was laying on the side of the road, not inside the car. They could not wrap their mind, because the door wasn't open. I mean, it was bent, folded shut, flames engulfing the joint. And this young lady, who was probably 17 or 18 at the time, the crazy thing is that she loved to sing. She sang at their church. She was involved in their choirs and things like that. Number one, she had no damage to her lungs or her windpipe in any way, shape, or fashion. Still sings to this day. She's an adult now. Two, when Rod went up to visit with her and meet with the family, it was as if the top half of her body, from like the lungs up, were just completely shielded from flame and smoke. Didn't even smell like smoke. She had burns on her arms and legs, but they were relatively minor for what she'd been through. And the whole time she kept saying, did you ever find the other guy? Did you ever talk to the other guy? And Rob was like, what are you talking about? They were like, sweetie, you were in a single car accident. You weren't anybody else in the car. You're driving home. She's like, no, somebody pulled me out of the car and put me on the road. She goes, I remember it. He shielded my head and my body and my top half and got me out of that car and laid me on the side of the road. And Rod just sat there. He said, I remember back to the book of Hebrews. And I said, you never know when you may be entertaining an angel. In that moment, and it just sends shivers up my spine. God intervened in her life and sent somebody out of time and space, call it an angel, call it a whatever, reached down instantly and removed her body from that wreck and laid her on the side of the road safely, and knew I need to protect her so she could still sing. And she still does and honors God with that gift to this day. I don't know how to explain that. Can't explain it. I can't explain it, but it don't make any sense to me. And that was 25, 30 years ago when that happened. But God still does it every day. All around the world. All around the world, he does things just like this. For those who trust and believe with faith that there's healing in his wings. It doesn't take much. Just a little bit goes a long ways. Just a drop. Changed the whole thing. When Elijah was in that cave, he was on the run, and he just had the Mount Carmel experience, and God had just showed his wonder. He told Elijah to calm him down. I'm going to pass by the mouth of that cave just for a blip. calm your spirit to know that I'm with you. Why so little much? Because no one can fully take on the full glory of God in our earthly form. That we'd burst into dust. There's just no way to do that. We're not equipped for that on this side of eternity. So it only takes a drop to do unparalleled things with faith. That's why Jesus said it only takes a mustard seed amount. It only takes a tiny, tiny bit. I mean, the Old Testament says that when God opened up his mouth, stars and moons and planets fly out. Right? Just to get a picture of the enormity of it all. So when Jesus just touches a little bit like that, he can do so much. He can restore health fully and completely. I had Rod in my notes because I wanted to close with this story. Rod was an interesting character as a preacher. He had all kinds of experiences. And when he was a young pastor, like right out of college, First Church, Little B Church, he grew up back east and came to Oklahoma and came to seminary in Texas and then kind of ended up in this area. And he remembers preaching in a little bitty town. I believe it was Stroud, it was Stroud or Chandler, little bitty town, and having fried okra for the very first time. He'd never had it before. And he was like, what is this what is this dish? And how do I have it every day of my life? And then I fried okra, and he's like, what's okra? Like he didn't really, he's like, I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up, I didn't have that, nobody was growing stuff out where I lived. It was like this wasn't an experience that he'd had a lot of. And he said, I got infatuated with it. Anytime I went to a restaurant, everybody's like, do they serve fried okra here? So he ends up in Oklahoma as a pastor, young pastor. And he tells his wife, I want to grow okra at our house. And she's like, okay. Well, if we got some farmers, we grew okra on my place when I was growing up. We had quite a bit of it. But as you know, okra is just a weed in and of itself. And what do you do when you don't really tend to the weeds real well? They really do a great job of duplicating themselves. So his first couple batches of okra, plentiful. But he didn't really think about all those millions and millions of little seeds in one little deal of okra. Those are all tiny little baby okras. They're going to grow up to make more okras, and just in a pestilence kind of way. And so it just starts creating more okra than he can. He's like, I had more okra. I was freezing it. I was trying to give it away. I was like, I didn't know what else to do. He said, so I just had this idea one day in my backyard, my little garden. He said, I was over it. It's like, this is just too much. I can't take it. So I got my little tiller up. I just tilled up all that okra. And then the greatest okra crop you've ever seen in the history of time began to sprout up out of the ground. He said it took over my backyard like it was like a fire. Whoa! Like I had okra from fence to fence, wall to wall. And he's like, what have I done? And he's like, and he said the folks at his church were like, you tilled it up? They're like, dude, all those little seeds just went everywhere, man. He's like, you're going to have okra for like the next 1,000 years. He's like, and I did. It was a process of me the whole time me being the pastor at Little Bitty Town, dealing with those couple of okra plants turning into a forest of okra in my backyard. It doesn't take much. But when you stir it up and you break it loose and you turn it loose, man, it can take over everywhere. It can change everything. The landscape, how things are seen and experienced, something so small and simple. And when I think about these miracles we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, whether it be this woman who bled, or a blind man, or Lazarus, or any other countless miracles, water into wine, which was one of his first miracles, and in kind of his on-the-scene moment, coming out party, if you will, in ministry, it's always about stirring up the moment so that the movement grows. That's all it was ever about. So that when God does a miracle in your life, whatever it looks like, be tiny, small, not even a big deal, but it's still a miracle. Or he does something so big that you cannot even wrap your mind around it. Whatever the case may be, what are you going to do with that story? Are you going to till it up and turn it loose so that it can grow and spread and impact somebody else? Or are you just going to close it up, put it in a box, and move on? Just another thing, just another happening. I hope you do the first. I hope that you will say to yourself, I will not let God doing a work in my life that is miraculous in its nature, no matter how big or how small, I will not let a moment like that pass to not tell that story. Can I tell you what God did for me today? It's that simple. Some people will listen, some people won't. That's not up for you. That's not up to you. Your job is to tell the story. Now, some stories are going to be easier to tell than others. Lazarus didn't need much of a conversation starter on that one. He didn't need to dance around the weather and the day of the week and what's the almanac saying? It's, talk to me about you being dead for like a week and now you're back. What's that about? You jump right into that. Or you're blind your whole life. What was it like to see for the very first time? But for you, it could be, let me tell you about this. Can I tell you what happened this week that's unbelievable to me? It may start out something as simple like that. You'll never believe what I saw and experienced today. One of the things I love about Oklahoma, where we live, is, and I think it's one of those things that we're just blessed. Man, I love the sunsets here, man. Aren't they awesome sometimes? My goodness. It's like that old song, it's like heaven's gates are wide open. A little bit of light out. That's worth talking about. That's a miracle in and of itself. If you cannot find something to talk about, don't forget that. That God's beauty and wonder on display is miraculous in and of itself. And somebody's going to try to tell you about the gases and the dirt and the this and the what in the air makes the light reflect. That's fine. That's how God does it. Hey, good for you. You solved how God did it. That's awesome. You tell them that. We live in a time where God does these types of things every single day. We just have to be diligent as believers to notice them, to be amazed by them, and then to go tell somebody about them. That's your job. That's my job. That's our job. Let's pray.